Hey guys, Caleb here. In this video, we're going to talk about the Panasonic S1H. This is the S1, not the S1H, so don't get confused, but I'm going to use it as a prop because that's helpful. And what I want to do is talk about why I think the S1H is a really important camera and why we should care about it, even if you're not going to pick one up. We'll be getting to specs here in a little bit and some very interesting things to keep in mind. Stuff we know, but more importantly, stuff we don't know yet. And I think a lot of that's going to change here in the future. But what's so special about this camera? Well, first and foremost, it is a fully blown cinema camera. The S1H is a cinema camera that shoots stills, not a stills camera that shoots video, which is kind of a first for full frame. Now, the Sony A7S II and the original Sony A7S was definitely a camera that was leaning more cinema than stills, but it was always a stills body. It never was a fully blown cinema camera, and I'm really excited to see what the S1H is like and how we're kind of moving that direction more and more. Because I've been saying for a while now that I think the cinema camera world and the mirrorless stills world is going to get closer and closer together until we have cameras like the C200 built like this in a small form factor and just tons of power in a tiny body that you can configure to best suit your needs as a filmmaker, you know, YouTuber, whatever it is you're shooting when it comes to video. To give an idea of what I'm talking about, think about the Canon XC15. It's a really awkward little camera when it comes to specs, but if you can imagine that style body, but with a larger full frame or Super 35 sensor, ND, you can start to see where I'm going with this. Small cameras that are built for video have the display properties of a video style camera, easy to access battery, even while it's on a tripod, all of that basic stuff. Another exciting thing about the Panasonic S1H is that it is a redesigned body. So Panasonic is not taking the S1 and recycling the body. They've redesigned it and come up with a new body altogether. So traditionally, these companies like Sony, Panasonic, Canon, they'll take the same body and reuse it again and again. So it's really interesting to me that Panasonic has given us a new body altogether. And I suspect that Sony's going to do the same thing with the A7S III, and that's why it's taking so long. I doubt Sony's going to take the A7 III body or even the A9 body to give us the A7S III. I think they're going to redesign it and do something similar to what Panasonic did with the S1H. So that's one reason I'm really excited about the Panasonic S1H. We have a new body, we have a real cinema camera. Similar to the GH5S, Panasonic is really going after video here in a small form factor, which I think is the future. So with all that talked about, let's jump into the specs and what we don't know and where the real big question marks are on this camera. And we're going to start with the body. Obviously it is taller and wider than the S1, probably going to be accommodating heat. It has a flip out screen, which is huge, and that is really interesting to me given that there's been kind of this war with flip out screens. A lot of people say professionals prefer this flip up, whereas we're seeing a professional cinema camera from Panasonic with a flip out screen, which I personally prefer. Also, very interestingly, there is a little vent on the side of the camera. We don't know what that is for yet from Panasonic. They haven't mentioned anything about it, but it's definitely there. So there's probably a fan in there, and we'll get to that here in a little bit and kind of circle back to that. But very interesting to see that on what would normally be a mirrorless style, weather sealed, enclosed body. We now have a vent. Getting to the video specs on the S1H, we're looking at 6K in a 3:2 aspect ratio, as well as 5.9K in a 16:9 aspect ratio. A big question mark with this is, will that be in 10-bit or 422? That might not be 10-bit and it might not be 422. So that remains to be seen. That has not been published yet from Panasonic. And then we've been told that this is a multi-aspect ratio camera with specs like being able to shoot at 4:3 aspect ratios. And when it comes to that, we're not sure what the crop is going to be. So there's no information as to whether or not we're getting a full sensor readout. We'll probably have to get that for 6K, but we don't know what's going on with all the crops and all that multi-aspect ratio stuff on the camera. When it comes to DCI 4K and UHD, we're looking at 10-bit 422 in camera, which is always good to hear. And I believe that's in the full frame readout, but again, we're not 100% sure on that. And finally, we have unlimited recording in all modes according to Panasonic, and that's pretty impressive. Will it overheat? Maybe, maybe not. We're gonna have that fan, so that will probably help with that. But glad to see that they're not gonna limit any of those 6K options, at least at this time. And then we also have Vlog, the fully fledged version of Vlog on this camera with, according to Panasonic, 14 stops of dynamic range, and it's supposed to really mix well with other, professional cinema cameras from Panasonic, including the VariCam and others. So now let's get to some stuff we don't know yet, and I think will be pretty interesting as we hear more about the Panasonic S1H. The first one is the HDMI output. What does it do? Are we gonna get ProRes RAW out of this camera? What are the specs? That remains to be seen. We have no information. The other thing I want to speculate on a little bit, and that's that vent we saw on the side of the camera on the back. Now that could be for the 6K resolutions, although I kind of have a feeling it might be for something else. I kind of wonder if we're going to get higher frame rates in 4K from this camera eventually, or if we'll see something insane like RAW internally on this camera. I just have a feeling that the fan and the way they beefed up this camera is not just because of that 6K. There's got to be something else in my head. I could be totally wrong on this. This is just me speculating. Again, I have no information, but I just don't feel like you would need that much of a beef up in the fan if you're doing 6K. We also don't know yet if there's going to be in-body stabilization on this camera. So that could be a huge, heat reducer if they do not have it. Maybe they'll do something like they did with the GH5S where they just removed it completely, went with a multi-aspect ratio, reduced heat. But this is a huge camera with a big mount, so they could technically, potentially include it. But if they don't have in-body stabilization, going back to my vent reason on this camera why there's a vent. If there's no in-body stabilization, there's less heat, so maybe things like internal RAW would be possible. Autofocus is another question mark on this camera. We're probably going to see the continued use of contrast-based auto detection instead of phase detection, but it would be amazing if Panasonic gave us a better autofocus solution for video. Maybe that's something they could do to offset the cost, is start throwing it into their higher end bodies, but probably not going to happen, just wishful thinking really on my part. And the last big question mark for me is, will the camera have electronic ND built in? Now, the chances of this happening are pretty low, but personally, I would take built-in ND over 6K, even raw video internally or externally for that matter. Having electronic ND or some form of ND in a small camera like this would just be incredible. And I think that would make a huge splash, but again, probably not going to happen. And finally, the last thing to talk about with this camera is not this camera, it is the Sony a7S III. At this point, Sony knows everyone's hand. They've seen all the cards, and now it's really up to them to make a move with the a7S III. Since Panasonic and others have released all their cameras, Sony can do some really interesting things. They can tailor the feature list, tailor the price to really try to beat all these options. And another thing we often forget is that Sony is making most of the sensors going in these cameras. Not all manufacturers like Canon, but Sony is producing a ton of sensors that are going into these cameras. So they could, in theory, take the exact same sensor and do more with it at a lower price in their own cameras. So something to think about. Can't wait to hear anything about the a7S III. And then the only last question mark is going to be Canon, who has remained very safe in this whole small mirrorless video related world. So I doubt they're really going to do anything that is at the price point of this camera and what Sony's going to come out with. So we're just going to have to wait and see. But as it stands, the S1H looks really impressive. I think it's going to be a big deal. It's the first full frame cinematic focused camera we've ever seen at this price point and at this size. I probably won't be buying one, but you never know what's going to happen, and hopefully we'll get one in for review to check out. That's going to do it for me in this video. Thank you for sticking in there with me, guys. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you in our next video.